Welcome to week 5, where we turn to Byzantine art and then look at Islamic art, which was not so far away from Byzantium. Byzantium became Constantinople, which was the new Rome. Rome was declining in power in the 5th and 6th centuries, and Byzantium became the replacement for Rome and the cultural center of the Western world. So as we look at this art, we will see a shift in the center from Rome to Byzantium, Constantinople, and it's now called Istanbul in Turkey. Byzantine art falls into the categories of 3 golden ages. The early Byzantine period starts with the Emperor Justinian I, and it goes from the 5th century to 726, which is when the iconoclastic controversy happened. We'll find out about that when people started to destroy images or decide that the church should not be using images, just something the Protestant church also argued. The Middle Byzantine period is from 843, when icons were reinstated, to 1204. And then the late Byzantine period began with the restoration of Byzantine rule in 1261 to 1453, which is the end of the Byzantine Empire, the end of the empire when it fell to the Ottoman Turks and became part of Turkey. And today Istanbul is part of an Islamic culture. Ravenna became the capital of the western part of the Roman Empire, Ravenna in Italy, when Rome was under siege. So Rome was being attacked, so basically all the powerful people moved over to somewhere where they could be safer. It turned out to be Ravenna. We'll look at a few buildings built in Ravenna in the 5th and 6th century. Many of them are very well preserved, and it would be a very beautiful place to visit someday. The Oratory of Galla Placidia is a small chapel attached to a bigger church in Ravenna. And as you can see, the exterior is fairly plain. But here's the inside, the contrast between the plain exterior and the interior with its elaborate mosaics and designs and narrative imagery creates a transition. There's a transition between the plain exterior and the elaborate interior that is the same as the transition, or a metaphor for the transition, or an enactment of the transition between earth and heaven. So earth is the mundane, the plain, then you come inside and you're in another supernatural realm. At least it's a metaphor for that. So here is an image of Jesus inside the Oratory of Galla Placidia. It reveals that Jesus is now an imperial king with a purple robe and a golden robe and a halo, which is related to the emperors. And he no longer has a shepherd crook. He actually has a cross in his hand. Previously, they did not Christians did not use the image of the cross because it was still an instrument of torture. But by this period, the cross became a symbol of Christianity. And here he is already being portrayed no longer as just the simple shepherd, but as a king. Christian art is officially part of the empire now. This is another dome in Galla Placidia, and there's a cross in the center with a starry night displayed, basically. The contrast between the plain exterior and the elaborate interior is most beautifully represented with this domed mosaic, because of the way that it's a representation of heaven almost. It's like the starry sky with the cross in the center. And I think this is one of the most evident moments when you see this transition between earth on the outside and heaven on the inside. So they were trying to create a certain kind of experience with a church like this. In the east, so we're back to Constantinople now, from Italy to Constantinople. One of the most remarkable churches ever built was constructed in the 6th century. So Constantinople was now the new Rome, so major building projects were happening here as opposed to in Rome at this point. After rioters burned the church that previously stood where Hagia Sophia now stands, the Emperor Justinian, encouraged by his wife Theodora not to flee, he wanted to flee, she said, no, stand and fight or die. He squashed the rebellion, and he may have killed 30,000 people in the process. And then he built a new church on the site. He employed two scholars and architects, mathematicians, Anthemius of Tralles, who studied geometry and optics. Optics will be important because that's the way we perceive and see things, and that became really important as you look at the interior of the church. And Isidorus of Miletus, a physicist who studied vaulting, so he knew about how to create this structure. They designed this very innovative piece of architecture and created this very innovative dome, as you will see. And the skilled masons who built it were able to build the church in only 5 years. And this was in the years 532 to 537. So here is the interior. It's a massive building, and it's an obvious display of power, following the assumption, of course, that the bigger your building, the more powerful you appear. So Emperor Justinian created the biggest building he could. The main dome in the center seems to float. And this is the sort of the stunning feat of construction, especially this dome and the way that it seems to float. There's not just one reason, though, that it seems to float on air. There's a variety of different reasons for this. So the first reason is that there is obviously a ring of windows here underneath at the base of the dome. And so it seems as if the dome is being supported on light rather than on solid structure. And this photograph shows the way that the light almost dissolves the separations between the windows. The second reason is that the supporting piers are obscured. So everything is sort of hidden and recedes backwards, along with the pendentives that connect the dome to the supporting piers. And they are submerged into the darkness of the aisles, and so it's as if the usual supports are not even there. So you don't see the dome where the dome is actually supported. And then the third reason is there's a use of gold mosaic to cover the surface of the dome and the pendentives. And here's the gold mosaic you can see covering the surface so that it seems as if everything in the wall dissolves into light. The gold, because obviously the gold will reflect the light, so creating that sensation that it's all light. So those are a few reasons why it seems to float. Then if you look back here at the exterior, you can see that there are buttresses on the outside that do support the windows in the dome. So there is strong reinforcement, but the sort of optical illusion, remember one of the architects studied optics, is as if it's not supported by anything, as if it's been dropped from heaven. The dome did fall in 558, but it wasn't because of the windows, and it also needed to be repaired a few times, but nothing has happened to it since the year 1346, despite several earthquakes. So another incredible feat of architecture. So inside Hagia Sophia here, the liturgy celebrated the Eucharist. And the way that they celebrated the Eucharist was different than what we would know in most Protestant and Catholic churches today, although if anybody is Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, or Greek Orthodox, or Coptic, Eastern Orthodox, they'd be probably a little bit more familiar with the way that Christians celebrated the Eucharist in the 6th century. So the Mass was celebrated behind a screen, and that's not something you can see in this image. But the screen eventually became an iconostasis. So only the priests were able to celebrate the Mass, and they did it behind a screen, and then they later did it behind this iconostasis, which is a wall hung with devotional images. So if you go into an Orthodox church, oftentimes the front of the church, there's a wall of icons, basically, a wall of images of saints, etc. And an icon is the Greek word for image. So the congregation was focused on this wall of icons, either on the iconostasis, or in this church they'd be focused on the dome, so their eyes are constantly being lifted upward. So they're putting into practice what the spiritual writers of the time advocated, that Christians meditate in order to be elevated from the material world to the spiritual world. So by being in this church and lifting your eyes upward, it was as if you're practicing that spiritual practice of elevating yourself from the physical material world into the spiritual world. So back in Ravenna, another kind of elevation was happening. The interior covered in gold makes the structure appear to dissolve in shimmering light and color. Another employment of that use of gold to give you a sense of being in a jewel box, in a heavenly jewel box, or as if you are just completely surrounded by light and nothing else, nothing material. This is San Vitale, Church of San Vitale. And inside, here's a mosaic from that same church, from the apse. These two mosaics are facing each other. This is another example of an absentee emperor making sure his presence is felt here. Just like Constantine was not present in Rome, remember we saw the big statue of Constantine, that was put in Rome so that Constantine's presence would be there even though he himself was not there. Same thing here. Justinian and his wife, the Empress Theodora, probably never went to Ravenna, Italy, but in order to unite the empire, his image needed to be there. So they're pictured in mosaics facing each other in the apse, and both are wearing purple robes and halos. Remember, that's the imperial insignia. They are presenting gifts to the church, and thus they're presenting gifts to Christ. Just as the Magi, it's hard to see, but if you look in your book, you might get a better sense. On her cloak, there are images of the Magi presenting gifts to Jesus, the wise men. And the style of these figures is very interesting because the use of shadows does create a sense of modeling in their faces. Again, the details aren't very easy to see here, but there is a sense of shadowing on the facial features of these portraits. But the space is very shallow, so there's no sense of depth, no sense of the depth of the space. And the figures cast no shadows. They appear very flat. The mosaic paintings, your book kind of talks about this, are both flattened and three-dimensional, abstract and representational. And what makes them abstract? Just that they're not as realistic as, say, a Renaissance painting. I'm sure you can imagine what a very realistic painting or photograph would look like. These are a little bit more abstracted, even though they do have representational features. And the images of the emperor and Theodora allow a certain metaphor to be at work. So the metaphor that we saw in Galla Placidia is the difference between the plain exterior, the very simple exterior, and the ornate interior, very elaborate interior. So that was the metaphor between the contrast between earth and heaven, and here it's very similar. There's a metaphor between the contrast between the natural and the supernatural. So here, the natural would be whatever is realistic and recognizable, and the supernatural is that which is abstract and geometric and beyond the natural. So remember with the Tetrarchy, we saw the use of the geometric abstractions in those portraits of the emperors, and those portraits suggested transcendence. And that was in stark contrast to the realism we'd already seen in the Greek and Roman sculptures. There was a total break with the Tetrarchy in iconography, and they created very abstract portraits to make them seem more transcendent. And so a similar metaphor is happening with the icon, the religious icon. Both the natural and the supernatural are present in the image, offering a viewer an encounter with an image that's also an avenue towards the divine. So the image provides them a possibility of transcendence. So besides for church mosaics, during this period, there were also smaller versions of art, including illuminated manuscripts. The Rosano Gospel is an illuminated manuscript, which is a manuscript decorated in gold and colors and has both text and image. This is Raising of Lazarus. It's a codex made on purple vellum. Purple just refers to the kind of dye that was used, even though the color the resulting color varied. The manuscript brings Old and New Testament together, and similarly is bringing word and image together. So here we have raising of Lazarus on the top, but underneath, so you can see the story, right? Here's Lazarus coming out of the tomb and Jesus with this halo. But underneath you have Old Testament figures. The prophets Isaiah, Hosea, and King David are pictured. King David gets to be pictured twice. And they're under the narrative, and they're speaking quotes from Psalms, Hosea, and Psalms and Isaiah. So their own quotes are underneath them, right? So from Isaiah, we'll be speaking a quote from Isaiah, etc. And the words that they're speaking are words about resurrection. So that connects the Old Testament figures to the resurrection of Lazarus. So multiple meanings and layers are happening at one time. So the big question at this time was, how do you depict God? How do you depict God? How do we portray God? They inherited a certain iconography and certain ideas from Imperial Rome, and that influenced the way that they thought about the images of God. So, for example, when the emperor had an image made of himself, the emperor's subjects were expected to treat the emperor the same as the image, or the image the same as the emperor. So even if Constantine wasn't in Rome, people had to respect his sculpture, the sculpture of him, in the same way they would respect him himself. The reverence offered to an image is the same as the reverence offered to the person that the image depicts. So if you reverence an image of an emperor, it's the same as giving that reverence to the emperor himself, and you had to treat the image the same as you would treat the emperor. The honor given to the image is the same as the honor given to the prototype of the image. The prototype is the person the image is representing. In addition, when the emperor was not in a particular city, it was as if the image was his presence. So in the same way, an icon was thought to be, in some way, the presence of a saint or Christ. Icons were not meant to merely illustrate biblical texts. We think of Christian art as an illustration of a story, but they were not simply meant to do that. They were not meant just to teach the illiterate. They were actually meant for people who were already initiated into the faith. And they were aids in worship. So they helped people in their devotion to God and in their worship experience. They were, in a sense, intermediaries between humans and the holy figures that they represented. So they allow you to experience or to worship God, but you're not supposed to worship the icon itself. You're supposed to allow it to help you worship God who is beyond the icon. And it comes out of the theology that comes from Scripture, which is that, for example, in Colossians 1:15, it says, Christ is the image of the invisible God. So the idea that God is invisible, but there is an incarnate image of God, influences the idea of the icon in that, yes, this icon is just an image, but at the same time it can point us to something else. Christ is the Word made flesh, the image of God in human form. And so this allows the earlier prohibition against images to change, to be transformed theologically. Christ came as an image, so images could depict him in his human nature, right? So if he had a body, well, why not be able to paint images of that? Of course, images could not depict the divine nature. But at the same time, another thing is that God is present in everything, and so God could be present in these icons just as God is present everywhere. But there's also the important distinction to always make, which is that the Christian God is also beyond the body, and so Christian art aimed at leading the faithful to union with God, into a participation that went beyond the body, beyond images, beyond the senses. So icons were a tool towards that, but they weren't the ultimate goal. So these were the arguments made by people who supported icons. But there were also others in the 8th century who rejected icons and then banned icons. They were called iconoclasts. Iconoclasm means image breaking in Greek. So the iconoclasts fought against the use of icons, and there were many reasons that they decided to destroy images. First of all, there was the fear of the rising power of monasteries that drove the iconoclast. So icons were associated with monasteries. The monasteries were becoming more powerful, and so there was sort of a fear of their ascendancy. Another reason for the iconoclastic controversy was that Muslims were aniconic. They didn't encourage images. They didn't really use images. It was against idolatry in their religion, as we'll see later in the lecture. And Muslim invaders of Constantinople and the region succeeded in battle. And the Christian emperors thought that perhaps God was displeased with them for carrying the image of Mary when they went into battle, which was something that they would do. So they saw the success of the Muslims and they thought, well, maybe God is actually favoring them. And the iconoclasts also argued that only Christ is the true image of God. So if only Christ is the true image, then we can't use other images. We don't need other images. And in fact, other images can be idolatrous. Some people were using icons as if they had magical powers. For example, there is a story of one woman who had a well that she dug, and it was dry. It didn't yield any water. So she got a couple of guys to lower an icon into this dry well. And then the well, once she'd lowered the icon into the bottom of the well began to produce water. So this magical power of icons, this possibility of idolatry, was definitely a legitimate concern. So for the iconoclasts, only the cross could be used. And they would wipe out, this is an image of a person whitewashing an image of Jesus. But this image would be pro-icons, and so this artist is connecting the iconoclast to the people who were crucifying Jesus. The iconophiles were those who loved and supported images, and they eventually won out. So until the Protestant Reformation, until the 16th century, when these issues started out to come back again, the reformers made some of the same arguments as the iconoclasts. But in 843, the empress reinstated icons. And so for hundreds of years, icons continued to be part of Christian worship and formation and liturgy. So the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai in Egypt preserved many early icons, portable icons that were on boards that could be carried around, not just permanently inscribed in walls. This monastery was far away from the centers of power, so it was relatively ignored. And so it was able to preserve some very old icons. The site of Mount Sinai is significant because it's the site where Moses encountered God and went up on the mountain and received the law. Now, of course, nobody knows if this is really Mount Sinai, but it's also associated with the burning bush when God spoke to Moses out of the burning bush, so telling him to go ask Pharaoh to let his people go. So Mount Sinai, this monastery, is significant in that it's a place where Moses encountered God. Moses had a very powerful and real encounter with God in this place. So in this monastery, icons similarly provide monks and worshippers with divine encounters. The icons allow people to encounter God, just like the burning bush allowed Moses to encounter God. The bush was not God, right? But it created a vehicle for God to speak. So the Sinai Christ that we saw back here, this is from Mount Sinai, and the Sinai St. Peter and Theotokos, St. Peter and Theotokos and Child with Saints, show Roman-style paintings, but the saints in the front, so here we have Roman-style painting in both of these, but the saints in the front here are more stylized. They are less, there's less modeling and shadow. They're more flat. So in this icon, there's the use of at least two styles at once going on. And an important thing to remember as you look at icons is that they're most often viewed within the context of a worship space. Even the portable icons would be arranged in the space. And so when you look at an image such as this mosaic here, the crucifixion at the Church of the Dormition, think about the way that the light would bounce off the space and make the gold glitter. We saw already how light was important. The space, the gold within the space creates a space beyond the space, a space beyond the natural world, you know? So it's this elevation to the supernatural. In this image, there's already, again, no sense of space anyway. So Christ is floating on a gold background, as if he is in the heavenly realm. The only indication of a place is this little mound with these little plants here. It's as if he is suspended in eternity. So the style of this icon appeals both to the emotions with sort of the emotional appeal and the elegance and the subtle emotions expressed on the face, as well as the intellect. Another interesting aspect of the images within the church is the way that they allowed participants in the liturgy to become part of a community that was broader than them. So here we have this dome with Christ in the center and the apostles surrounding him. So for people in the church, it was as if they could be with the apostles in some sense, worshiping with the whole body of Christ, dead and alive, all together in the same place. Another interesting function of images in relation to the function of the space is in Anastasis, in which Christ is pulling Adam and Eve from their tombs. And this function of this space, as your book talks about, at times was used for funerals. And when a funeral happens, it's as if the image reminds people what they believe will happen to the person who has just died, that person will be pulled from the tomb. So again, the importance of what's going on in the space to the meaning of the image itself. What's going on in the space actually enhances the image's meaning. Now we move towards the east to the desert outside of Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad in 570 to 632 CE received visions from God. He had to flee Mecca and go to Medina, but was able to gather 10,000 people 8 years after fleeing, and then return to Mecca and establish the city as the spiritual capital of Islam, the religion he had founded. Islam means submission to God's will, and those who follow Islam are called Muslims. And Muslims meet together to pray in mosques and to be led by an imam, who's not the same as a priest or an intercessor or an intermediary between people and God, but is more of a teacher of the congregation as everyone worships together. In Mecca, the Kaaba is a cubical shrine covered in black cloth with gold embroidery. And Muslims are expected to go on pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. So this is an image of the Kaaba. Islam spread very rapidly during the 7th century, conquering Sasanian, Persian, Egyptian empires, and Byzantine provinces. So here you can see Mecca is down in this region down here. And armies spread rapidly throughout the whole Mediterranean. And they incorporated diverse cultures. So this allowed for a very rich artistic tradition in which there was a melding of different styles to serve this new religion. So a lot of different, very different cultural styles were incorporated into this new religious iconography and art. But they were aniconic. Islam was aniconic. And so that also had a very profound influence on the trajectory of its art. It didn't mean people stopped making art. It meant that they went in different directions. So Muhammad came back to Mecca and rid the Kaaba of the pagan idols, and he extended this ban on idols beyond just this particular place to a complete discouragement of figural imagery in general. So Islamic artists became limited in their subject matter, and that limitation allowed them to excel in a number of different things. They really focused their energy on surface decoration and ornament, so the surfaces of the mosques, Abstraction and geometric designs in line and color and pattern became really important and intricate. And there were other media. There were a variety of media that they excelled in terms of cutting tile or calligraphy, things like that. The use of organic forms became an important focus, such as vines and plants and flowers and things like that. And then also script, the rendering of text in calligraphy. So all of those became the focus, and that allowed for advancements and innovations in each of those areas. Another interesting thing that your book talks about is the difference between the Shiites and the Sunnis, which goes back to which is on 263 of your page 263 of your book, which I think is an important distinction for all of us today to be aware of. So just to point you there. So the Dome of the Rock is located in Jerusalem, and it's the third most holy site in Islam. This is the site of the first and second Jewish temples. So it was originally a Jewish site. And according to tradition, the site is the site of the creation of Adam, and also the site where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, which is an Old Testament story. And for Muslims, it's the place where Muhammad ascended to God. So this is a very significant spot. And it's significant for three religions. It's a building in the Byzantine style. It's a central plan building, again, which means that its axis is horizontal. And it has aisles where visitors can walk around the rock, the sacred rock where Muhammad ascended. And standing on this site, this is an important place for Jews and Christians. And so thus it manifests, in a sense, the Islamic view that Islam is the completion of the earlier monotheistic religions, which were Judaism and Christianity. Sorry, the other two monotheistic religions. Islam being the third, and what they see as the culmination of the other two. And all three are similar in being not only monotheistic, but also being people of the book. So their texts being extremely important. So in Cordoba, Spain, the Dome of the Great Mosque, which was built in 785 and 786, may symbolize the celestial canopy, or the heavens, and was based on complex mathematics and geometry. So already you see the importance of mathematics and geometry, not just as esoteric thought, but also as a way to inspire art. So in this period, math and art and philosophy all flourished under Islam. And they also were competing with Byzantium a little bit. So, in fact, the mosaics of stylized plants and the inscriptions in gold were made by a Byzantine mosaic artist. Islam itself has 5 pillars. The first is to proclaim that there's only one God and that Muhammad is his messenger. The second is a prayer towards Mecca 5 times a day. The third is to give alms, which is to generously give. The fourth is the fast of Ramadan, which happens every year. And the fifth is the pilgrimage to Mecca that each Muslim is supposed to take once in a lifetime. Now, after the 9th century, the Islamic world became more fragmented. So it's no longer this unified empire, and different regions were led by independent leaders. Thus, the art began to vary from region to region. So we'll see some varieties here. The Timurid dynasty in Iraq and Iran, ruled by Timur, a descendant of the Mongols. Remember Genghis Khan? He was also married to a descendant of Genghis Khan. And so he was able to integrate Chinese, Persian, Turkic, and Mediterranean artistic styles in the art of this empire. This art was known, the art of this dynasty was known for its brilliant blue and turquoise and white glazed ceramics. So here you see that already. The cobalt blue, the turquoise, and the white. And all of this incredible use of tile work can still be seen today. Each of these pieces was cut by hand, even the lettering. Islam emphasized the reading and studying of the Quran, and the reading of the Word of God is an act of religious devotion. Thus, incredible traditions of intricate calligraphy developed out of this devotion to the Word. At first, calligraphers wrote on parchment and vellum, which both come from animals. But paper was manufactured in Central Asia in the 8th century, and it began to come to the Muslim world. And by the year 1000, paper had replaced these animal products, the vellum, for example. And paper was this new, inexpensive medium that allowed a surge in book production, allowed them to create many more books, and so to develop this style of calligraphy, or to develop different styles of calligraphy, in fact. This is a Kufic text, which was the text here, you can see the letters. They're very spread out, right? They're very large so that multiple people could look at the book at the same time and use the book in that way. So figurative imagery does play a small part in some Islamic art, or does play a part in Islamic art, most commonly in small-scale paintings. This wouldn't necessarily be in a mosque, but it's used for other purposes. This image from the Heart School from the Timurid dynasty depicts a bath inspired by the Greek and Roman baths of earlier days, although it's a little bit different because people are using these little bowls to splash water on themselves instead of using large tubs to be immersed. The image works because it balances the architectural setting with the activity of the human subjects, and there's a rhythm of color and shape, even though this sense of space is a little bit jarring or disjointed. The colors and the shapes create a nice balance that allow for a dynamic composition. And even the geometric designs cut up the space in an interesting way. Now, the Ottoman Empire was another empire with its own distinct style, and it lasted from 1342 to 1918. And it controlled Anatolia, western Iran, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, western Arabia, and northern Africa, except for Morocco, and parts of Eastern Europe. So it was a vast empire. And they were actually able to capture Constantinople and end the Byzantine Empire in 1455. Now that city is called Istanbul, as we've mentioned, and Hagia Sophia is now a mosque, which is why, if you look back at the image of Hagia Sophia, there are medallions with Arabic text inside Hagia Sophia. I might just try to show you that. Oops. Slideshow. Let's see here. There you go. So now you can see the Islamic text. That would not have been there originally, obviously, since it was originally a Christian church. So let's get back to now you can see that there is a similarity between the Mosque of Sultan Selim and Hagia Sophia. The Ottoman mosques, this is part of the Ottoman Empire again, were highly influenced by the Byzantine churches. So again, this cross-pollination of cultures. This mosque has a dome that is inspired by and reminiscent of the dome of Hagia Sophia. It's actually larger than the dome of Hagia Sophia. And light, again, comes in through the windows at the base. And there's arches under the dome that allow for light also to come in there. So again, even the heightened sense of the dome floating on light. The whole complex included a mosque, not just this mosque, but also educational buildings, cemetery, hospital, and a charity kitchen and markets and baths. In contrast to the Ottomans, whose art was inspired by the local cultures, such as, for example, the Byzantine Empire, so this was, the Ottoman Empire's art was inspired by wherever they were. The Safavid dynasty in Iran was inspired by the double-shelled domes of the Timurid dynasty, so there's sort of a lineage in this region. The double-shelled dome had a dome on the inside and a large dome on the outside. And the exterior dome here is decorated in blue tile, as you can see. And the Safavid dynasty is also known for its carpet making, bringing about a golden age for carpet making. And carpets such as the Wagner carpet brought the beauty of the outdoors indoors. So the beauty of the outdoors, as in a garden, it's hard to see here, but again, look in the image in your book. There are trees and bushes. These are meant to represent canals. And there are also animals interspersed throughout. So it's as if they are taking the trees and birds and flowers and streams to bring the garden from the outside to the inside, as if the garden were right under your feet. In addition, the flowers are also associated with paradise, which brings us full circle to back where we started. Remember, with Gala Placidia, churches were functioning as bridges between heaven and earth. It was as if entering the church was a way of entering into heaven. So in a different way, these carpets were aiming at something similar in terms of allowing paradise to come into a person's home. So next week we will leave this region completely. We'll crisscross from Asia to Africa and then back to the Americas.